so I have a 6-year-old, and then tried to have another after multiple miscarriages, decided to go through freezing embryos to then do IVF, hit like a rock bottom right before I was about to do a transfer, and decided like I couldn't go through with the transfer. Long story short, just hit like an emotional and physical rock bottom, and decided to go, right now it's not like for sure, but looking into the surrogacy route. Okay. So we have these embryos, and it's just a conversation. What I'm learning is that every experience is so unique, but there are a few things as women that we can do to make sure that we're doing whatever we can in our control. And that's why I'm so excited to talk to you two today, Siff and Dr. Knopman, who are having experience in this and who obviously deal with this on a daily basis. So I guess let's just start with you, Dr. Knopman, like your experience in fertility, like how you got started and why you got started and what you're doing now.
So I always wanted to be a doctor. I said it's since the second grade. I read a book about Elizabeth Blackwell, and my mom said I came home like, I'm going to be a doctor. I thought I wanted to be a breast surgeon and help women who had cancer. Like I worked at Sloan Kettering between college and med school. Got to med school, and I was like, I cannot do GI surgery for 5 years to get to GYN breast oncology. So then I was like, I love women's health. Yeah. Let's do OBGYN. And then once I was in OB, I thought, wow, I find hormones so fascinating. I think I'll be a fertility doctor. And then once I got into this space, I was in a unique time period because egg freezing was sort of being born when I was a fellow. So I was very lucky because I was there at NYU in the initial studies. And then I really devoted most of my career to fertility preservation for cancer and for social reasons.
Oh, amazing. Okay. And then Siff, what has your journey been like in this sphere?
So I was telling Dr. Knopman, and you obviously know, but I don't have any kids, but I have a business that is 3.5 years old. Like it's literally my child, and
your full-time toddler.
It's like truly like, and obviously like I'm joking because it just cannot be compared, but I feel like my entire life is my business right now, and I cannot imagine having a child right now. And I was like literally just in the car with my EA, and I was like, you know, I have friends who have businesses at the same stage that we're at, and they're moms, and I don't know how they do it because to me, like, this is so all consuming, and I run the business with my husband. So it's not like, you know, he has his own thing and I have, like, this is like our thing, you know? So I just turned 32, like, 4 days ago. And thank you. Yeah. And it's this like egg freezing has been very top of mind for me because, you know, I've obviously had multiple conversations with my friends who are having a really tough time conceiving because, you know, they didn't freeze any eggs or embryos or anything. And the piece of advice that I've been hearing consistently over the last couple of years is make sure that you freeze your eggs and like really start thinking about fertility before before
it becomes a problem.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Right. So when, you know, like I heard about this podcast opportunity, I was so excited because I want to do it this year and I just want to learn as much as I possibly can.
We spoke about that because we said you're at like the sweet spot age, right? Where like if you don't do it, then your chances of it working go down a little bit. Yeah. So like that's really the age to do it.
Interesting. Yeah. Because at 32, I got pregnant with Sunny like really easily. Like I went off birth control within a couple months. I was pregnant. And then at 34, and this isn't to say like this is just my experience. And so it's hard to talk about this stuff without talking about your own experience. But I also want to put the disclaimer out there that like this is just all our individual experience. So not to like judge your own compared to it or think that your outcome is, you know, label your outcome because it looks different. But anyways, so I then had a really hard time, and we had like 2 autopsies after the miscarriages, and they said that they were just like chromosomal issues. So after the 4 miscarriages, we decided to do the embryo freezing. So I always think like, I wonder if I had frozen eggs from when I was younger and tried IVF earlier, would I have like a little 2-year-old by now? And you don't want to look back and have regrets. And that's the one thing, like this is basically that insurance to not have regrets. So I guess we can start with like, what age do you recommend thinking about it and, up to what age,
But you just nailed it, because what I say to patients is when I see women to come in for egg freezing, I'm like, listen, you're never going to regret doing this.
Right.
You will regret not doing it, because if you come back and even if those eggs don't work, you're going to say, I washed my hands of it. I did everything I could with the information I had. But if you don't do it, you come back and you have infertility, you're going to have so much regret that you didn't do something. It's interesting. So egg freezing has gone through so many iterations, because when it first came out, the women who were freezing were in their early 40s and late 30s. And that's why it got such a bad rap, right? People were like, egg freezing's terrible. You read all these books, like it's the worst thing. I'm like, yeah, because the women
quality
had
of the
eggs worst eggs, right?
Right.
So now I tell women our technology is better, but the women who are freezing are at the age that they should be when they freeze. So if you come in your late 20s, early 30s, and you freeze a good number of eggs, you should feel really comfortable. I find it very challenging to find the age that's too old, or because I sit there and I wonder, I'm like, well, should I tell this 43-year-old that she shouldn't do it? But then she's sitting there and saying, I know there's less than a 10% chance or a 5% chance, but I don't want to not have done something. So I have this whole internal debate, because as a doctor, it's like the art and science of medicine, but then also risk and benefit and all of that. So I usually tell women, as long as they understand that the chance of it working is very low, nobody's going to tell you not to do it, as long as you don't have medical issues that would make it more complicated.
So then can you tell, though, when, is there a test that happens beforehand and you kind of know, okay, maybe your chances are lower, or do you just go by age?
So that's a great question. So there's no test for fertility. People always say, oh, I did the fertility test. I'm like, what's that? Because I don't know what that is, right? We can test for egg quantity. And that's what people are walking around saying, oh, my egg quantity. So that's called your AMH level, and an ultrasound called your AFC level. And together, these parameters will say, okay, if Siff does IVF egg freezing, she'll get 12 eggs. And Jaime, if you're her doctor, you have to give her this dose. But it doesn't tell me, of those 12 eggs, does she have 1 baby, 2 babies, or no babies? But what I say to women is, the younger you are, the more your eggs are quote unquote worth, right? Because if you at 32 can freeze 14 eggs, those 14 eggs have so much more potential than if you froze 14 at 42. Mm-hmm. So we can give you statistics. We can say for a 32-year-old with 14 eggs, she has an 80% chance she has a viable embryo. But nobody can ever say to you, you have a baby in there, because there's no test for egg quality.
Interesting.
Which is why when you said about embryos, the difference between eggs and embryos, so you can tell the quality of eggs through an embryo. Right? So once an egg is fertilized by a sperm, it makes an embryo, and then it has to grow in the lab and demonstrate competence. So what I always say to patients, I'm like, the lab is like natural selection in an unnatural fashion. Because if your embryo makes it, we know it can go the distance. And then we one step further, and speaking about the miscarriages, we chromosomally test them. So we know, hey, you have 3 embryos with the right genetics. Mm-hmm. And that's going to give you, at a CCRM lab, it's going to give you a 70% live birth rate, which is huge.
Right.
But you can't tell that with an egg.
Yeah. So for you, since you have a partner that you are going to have the kids with, you're better off actually making, not to tell you what to do.
That is what we're
better off making embryos.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what we're planning on doing.
Yeah. If a patient has no partner, I always say that, I'm like, 99% of the time, a patient walks in with no partner, they're freezing eggs. 1% of the time, I'll have a woman who's like, I want to make embryos with donor sperm. I'm usually like, wait, pump the brakes, because once you fertilize that egg with donor sperm, you can't unfertilize it.
Yeah.
I just want you to be clear on that. And actually, 50% of partnered couples that I'm seeing are doing eggs and or embryos, right? So sometimes patients will say to me, hey, listen, I love this guy. I think it's going to go the right way, but I'm not 100%. So I'm always make the eggs, right? Because you don't want to be in a situation where he won't let you use the embryos, or it's just cleaner.
It gets tricky.
But for you, it's pretty clear. So you'd make embryos.
Right. Can eggs also, if they aren't fertilized, decrease in quality as years go by, the longer that they're not used? So that's just a rumor.
Okay. Once they're submerged in the liquid nitrogen and frozen, they're frozen at that stage.
Okay.
Now, certain countries have rules, right? If you go abroad, you go to the UK or France, they're only going to let you freeze eggs for 10 years or 5 years. They're very strict.
Okay.
Here, you can really do whatever you want. But what I say to patients is, I'm like, you will get to a point where it's not safe to be pregnant, right? So you can't walk in, and we see this like at 54 and say, oh, I want to use my eggs. I'm like, but now you're 54. Right. You could use them with a surrogate, I guess, but you can't. You have to remember that you're going to age as well.
Okay, so you're going down the road of egg freezing. You find a CCRM, and what is like the first doctor's visit? Like, what's the journey from beginning to end of egg freezing?
I need like granularity.
And like physically too. Like, how do you feel afterwards? I mean, I know when I got my eggs taken out what it felt like, but just walking us through.
You did embryo,
So I
right?
did an egg retrieval and then made embryos.
Got it, okay.
So I did it essentially, right?
The front half, though, is exactly the same. The shots, the ultrasound and blood work, the egg extraction is the same whether you freeze eggs or freeze embryos. So that's all the same. Most people experience in those 10 days bloating. Some people feel fatigued. I've also had people say they feel super energized. You will have to like modify your lifestyle, meaning you can't jump, twist, or turn. So if you were training for a marathon, I would say don't do it then. But it's terrible.
Manageable. Like you think at the beginning, I remember my first visit being like really overwhelmed. Like there's a lot of information being given to you and you have to give yourself injections, or you can drive into the doctor's office if you want to for them to give injections. But there's like a whole protocol that you have to follow every day and be on certain medications. So it's like definitely a thing, but it's not, for me at least physically, it didn't take such a huge toll. And I thought it was a huge bonding experience for me and my husband, like kind of to look at it in that way. And it was more physically afterwards how uncomfortable I felt for like the 5 days after the retrieval.
After the 10 days?
Okay, yeah.
No, but Whitney's right. Like the 10 days of the shots, okay, they're not amazing. The
You're
worst
bloated,
time are
you're
the 5
uncomfortable.
days after. So I'm like, if you're going to a black tie wedding, do not plan it then because you will hate how you look in the dress. Like, are you going to go on a beach vacation? Probably not. But you're going to be bloated. It'll be bad for 5 days. You'll wear like sweatpants and leggings, and then you'll be back to your
like. Is it just bloating, or is it like you're in pain and you can't concentrate on work? Like, what is it?
No, you can concentrate. I think you have cramping, right? Like a bad period cramping.
It's like that. It's like you just feel pressure in your belly, but you can totally focus on work. I was like, it was hard for me to walk around, so it's like very work from home vibes for a couple days afterwards. But there's no pain
you when I'm doing this.
Yeah, I'm there for you. There's no pain. Like after you just you feel. You wake up and you feel totally fine. Like you would never know that they have like been in there besides the bloating.
Because there's no incision. It's all vaginal. So you take like a tiny needle and you puncture the vaginal wall and you go into the ovary. So even though, yes, like there's some bleeding because you puncture the vaginal wall, it's not like a major abdominal
Wait,
do you do that yourself?
No, that's the egg freezing.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's basically like 10 days or 2 weeks of the injections and some medicine leading up to the actual procedure. And then you do the procedure and then there's just like a little bit of bloating afterwards. And then you're either freezing your eggs or your partner is going into the doctor's office to
provide the sperm
and then they freeze them. And then there is the testing process afterwards with that.
So if you do eggs, the eggs come out, we assess them for what's called maturity because only mature eggs can be fertilized, and then we would freeze them. If you're going to fertilize with partner sperm, we assess the eggs for maturity, and then we fertilize with your partner sperm. And then the next day you get a call, and we say, hey, you did great. You got 12 eggs, 10 were mature, 8 fertilized. And then we watch those 8 embryos grow for up to 7 days. And we're seeing, are they developing at the right rate? And the ones that do, that make it all the way through, they get a biopsy. We take a couple of cells from what will become their placenta, and we send that biopsy sample. We all send it at CCRM. We all send it to Colorado, and the embryo gets frozen. And then a couple weeks later, we will call you and say, hey, you had 4 embryos that went off for testing, 2 tested normal. We can tell you the gender if you want. We don't have to. And then we would say, okay, you have 2 embryos here for use whenever you're ready.
Mm-hmm. And up to how long can you use the embryo?
As long as you want.
Really?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Huh. Okay.
Yeah, it will feel so good once you do it because it will just be
It'll
like
be behind you.
Were you nervous,
you.
like when you were getting it done, like just when they retrieved the eggs and you were going through like the testing process and all of that?
That process I wasn't nervous for. It was the getting pregnant part that I was freaking out about. But the actual process of it all was not for me like emotionally tormenting. I mean, I felt hope because I had been for so long trying with no success. So I felt like I needed science to get involved to up my odds. And my husband and I are always like, what are the chances? What are the odds? You know, we always want to know the numbers, and it's so hard with that. But this with science and the human body, but this just like gives you a little bit more
because so much of the time
security.
We're like fighting it. You're so trying to be in control.
Yeah.
And then when you just sort of are like, all right, I'm good.
Yeah.
You take over.
Totally.
It's like a release in a way.
And let someone
right?
else, like a doctor that's a specialist, really like take it on for you. And they're looking at your body in a way that you can't see what's actually going on in there. So in thinking about CCRM, what factors, like I know you're probably thinking about where should I go to do this? Like
exactly.
what question should someone be asking when they're looking for a place to go freeze their eggs?
I always say the success of somebody's IVF cycle comes down to the IVF lab. I joke around, I'm like to patients, you can like me or not like me. It's going to be a long road if you don't like me. But it's not me, right? It's the men and women who work in the lab, because that's where you see the difference in success rates. And it's not just like there's so many intricate details in the lab. It's the oxygen, the nitrogen, how they manipulate, how they biopsy. And that's where you see the difference in success. For us at CCRM, there's multiple locations around the country, right? So if I lived in New York, I go to New York. If I live in Houston, I go to Houston. All of our labs are the same. So I think it's good to find a lab that's a good quality lab, find a doctor you like, make sure that it's convenient for your life, and then that's a great place to do it.
Mm-hmm. So the lab is I wouldn't
lab.
even know that that's something that I had to really think about or like do research on.
How can you even like make sure that you're going to a good
So
lab?
there's something called, there's different websites which will report our success rates, and that's an important place to look. Also, there's like word of mouth. Sometimes you can ask people. I always say you would never know as a layperson, because you would say, oh, I like that doctor, I guess it's them. But it really has so much more to do with the science. And so that's why it's so important to find a good lab.
Can I ask about your lab? Like, how does it work? Like, why is it like so up there?
So there's a lot of specifics, I guess I would say, that make a lab better than another lab. And it's, once the eggs go into the lab, you can have good eggs come out, but bad eggs become from if you are not paying attention to all of the different parameters. Because eggs are very sensitive, right? Embryos are sensitive. So what do they live in? It's called media, right? So everyone has like their own media. We call it the secret sauce, right? I don't even really know what's in there. So like, what's your media? How do you manipulate embryos? Is it out like this, like on a table? Is it under a hood? We do everything in an incubator, right? There's so many different attention to detail points that even me, and I've been in this field forever, doesn't always know exactly what they're doing to make it better.
Yeah, I did not know that. When going through this process, it was purely like a recommendation thing, which I think like we're in an awesome metropolitan city with people we trust and awesome doctors, but had I known this, like I would have done the research about my doctor's office. Like now I want to look into it. Like, not that anything is wrong or bad, but I think that that's such like a nugget of wisdom to share, because I didn't even know that.
Can I tell you guys the craziest story? Yeah. So one of my friends went to get her eggs frozen earlier this year, and it didn't work out because while she was going through like the shots, they like confused what she was supposed to take, and she couldn't get the extraction done because like her nurse practitioner confused what she was supposed to take, and so she was so bloated, she was in so much pain, but it just like it was like completely messed up.
So what does she do now?
She's gonna do it again next year, but she was like just like obviously like so shaken up by that because like I don't know, like and that's why like conversations like this are so important, because like women need to know like, okay, like where am I going, and like is it like a really, really good place? And obviously she'd done her research, but at the same time, like I don't know, for whatever the reason, it was a really messed up story.
People make decisions like sometimes people will be like, oh, I'm gonna go there because it's cheaper. I'm like, okay. I don't think,
this is not something to probably cheap out on for sure. Speaking of that, how much does it cost?
So this is the thing. I will say the fertility benefits landscape has changed dramatically, right? So when I first started doing this, nobody had insurance coverage for anything.
Yeah.
Now a lot of companies are offering not just infertility coverage, but what they call fertility benefits. And it really started with Google, Facebook, and Apple, right? They said to their employees, here's $20,000, $30,000, go do what you want. Most of the big companies in New York cover it now, cover fertility treatment. Most of the banks, the law firms, all of the tech companies. So people have a lot more options.
Through their work, yeah.
Through their work. Egg freezing is going to cost you about $11,000. IVF, embryo freezing with testing, is probably closer to $18,000 to $20,000. That is a lot of money for patients to spend out of pocket. The good news is if you have the benefit, then you can do it and store it and you're good to go. The not great news is if you don't, then you have to come out of pocket. But if you do it at a young age, you know that your success rates will be high.
Right. Can you get on a payment plan?
That's a great question. A lot of patients open credit cards, I think, in my experience, and I know that's probably maybe not the best idea.
I know, but you got to do what you got to do, right?
But there are different, they're almost like companies where you pay them and then they'll pay it down for you.
Right,
And then you pay
like
back,
a loan situation for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something that I've been wanting to look into ever since we started this, because as I've been going through it, it just adds up, and you're like, I cannot believe that something that is health related is not at least like,
I know, it's insane,
like a little bit covered. And so I've been looking. There are some organizations that try to raise funds for women who can't afford it, but it's. Yeah.
I'm the chief medical officer of Chick Mission, which you did a bracelet collab with us.
Yes.
And we provide grants so that women who have cancer can freeze their eggs ahead of treatment, and it's amazing. We've given hundreds of grants. That always struck me as the most unfair situation. You get diagnosed with cancer,
and then and then no one helps you have a family.
And then your ovaries are like terrible. It's like so not right. But we've done a really great job to raise funds, and even like your bracelets, like you donated a portion.
Okay, what are some misconceptions about egg freezing?
I think the biggest one is that, hey, I have 10 eggs, I must have 10 babies.
Yeah.
That's the biggest one, because I think a lot of times women aren't well counseled that an egg to embryo ratio is definitely not equal, right? The loss rate is pretty high. So most of the eggs that we ovulate, even when we're in our 20s, aren't good. So just because you have 10 eggs, it doesn't mean you have 10 babies. So I think that's like a really big one. I think another misconception is that people think it's like a super painful, arduous process. It's definitely involved, but it's really not that painful.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's so worth it.
I think the last one is that you don't need to think about it in your late 20s, early 30s, and that's actually probably the best time to think about it, because as you get deeper into your 30s, your quality is going to go down a lot. Right. So I think people are like, oh, I'm like 28. My husband jokes around. He's like, every dinner party we go to, you're sitting next to someone, and at the end, you're like, oh, she's going to freeze her eggs. And I'm like, he's like, what happened? Like, I offered to my nannies as like gifts, right?
It's amazing.
Because I'm like, guys, like, what are you doing?
Right.
You need to freeze your eggs.
Right.
Because I'm like, if you're not aware of what's out there, you're sort of going to pay for it later.
Yeah. So I got 21 eggs, and then we ended up being able to make 5 embryos that made it through.
Awesome. That's great.
And then we actually did a transfer a couple months ago of one of the embryos in our surrogate, and she miscarried after 9 weeks. And so that for me was like one of the most shocking, because I was like, this was tested, like genetically tested, but it's not a sure thing, it's not a sure thing. And so even for the embryos, is there a percentage of what will stick, or that's
a heartbreaking one?
Yeah,
the surrogacy miscarriage is terrible because you just assume a surrogate's sort of proven, but so usually it's for a surrogate it's like 70 to 80% success.
Yeah.
Wow,
usually
really?
If you have a tested embryo from like the best grading. The only thing sometimes I'll say is the surrogate a proven surrogate, meaning has she been a surrogate before? That may be the only like inched up success rate. But usually it's just like really, really bad luck. I had a surrogate that miscarried at 9 weeks, and she got like a horrible infection that like she just miscarried, right? Like I think it had nothing to do with her. She just got like super sick. And it just didn't go the right way.
Is it like like recommended to use a surrogate versus like getting the implant into yourself? Like,
well, it's totally your choice. I mean, getting a surrogate is like a totally involved and very expensive process.
Totally,
but if you can't carry, then it's something that you can look into. Or if you just choose that it's like this is something that works more for you. But I think that it's like a personal preference and also a financial thing.
Some women need it because, let's say, they may have no uterus or they may have a medical contraindication, like breast cancer patient. You know, you have breast cancer, you can't get pregnant immediately if you had a hormone-sensitive cancer, so a lot of those patients will use surrogates. If you have, like, let's say you have really bad diabetes, like there's other medical issues, or it's by choice, right? You could just say, this is not something that's going to work for me right now. I would like to use a surrogate.
Yeah, for me, it was just like, I've miscarried so many times. I've tried for 5 years now. I am at a rock bottom. Like, I was just, my life was revolving around it. I was depressed, like losing weight, still kind of like it affects me on an emotional level. And so for me, it was like a little physical and a lot emotional. And I feel at first I struggled with it because I was like, everyone's going to judge me because I didn't try to do the transfer and I didn't do everything that I possibly could to get
Honestly,
pregnant.
like,
And they're like going to look at it as this privilege that my family can afford. And then I started talking to people who use them, and it took me talking to other people who had been through it, though, to like help shed that. But it took me some time to come to terms with it.
I do not understand people having opinions on somebody else's body, like, and somebody else's family decisions. Like, I don't get it. Like, it's, you don't know them, and even if you do, like, I don't know.
But you know what I think it is? Sometimes I think it's like insecurity about yourself,
Yeah,
and
you're
you
just
push it on other
scared.
people.
Exactly.
So I'm like, you're feeling something, and therefore you're pushing it on that person. Like, why do you care what that person does? Like, it's not. In fact, it's not affecting you. Nobody's asking you to pay for it.
Right.
So
especially because like pregnancy is like, I don't know, it's like it's such a tough process, you know? Like, it's not straightforward or easy for anyone, and it's so, I don't know, it's like, where is your compassion and humanity if you're making comments or judgments about someone else's journey?
It was more like that I thought that I was afraid of what people were going to think, not even what they would say.
Yeah, exactly. Though,
you
the
know?
fact that people, like, you don't,
The fact that that's in my
Exactly.
my conscious, that would be in
Like,
there, whether it's in their conscious or subconscious. I know. Like, why should I even care?
Things that you are dealing with, like, I can't believe that this is like another thing that's piled onto women. Like, it makes me so
well, that's the other thing about
upset.
pregnancy. Like,
Yeah,
I was
I
very
know.
honest with this. Like, I hated pregnancy. I didn't like the way I felt. I didn't like the way my body looked.
Same.
And I felt like people were always like touching my stomach, and I'm like, am I crazy for like hating this? And I was so scared. I'm totally like honest. I was so scared to have my older daughter because I'm like, what if I like don't? If I'm just not cut out to do this because I'm like not maternal.
Yeah.
And I remember when she was born, I was like, oh my God, I love her. Like, I just hate pregnancy, but
Yeah,
I love her.
exactly,
Like, I just don't want to
exactly.
go through that. But it's like you're so scared because everyone's like, you should feel beautiful and lovely. I'm like, ugh. God,
I know. Well, that was how this whole thing got born for me. Like the YouTube series, I Love My Baby Butt, because I started just filming. My husband started filming me talking about how much pretty much I hated being pregnant, and I didn't want to put it out there because I was like, women are gonna judge and they're gonna, be like, but it's such a gift and it's such a, how could you complain? I'm like, no, this is not complaining. This is just like a women's experience, and we're allowed to have all different sorts of opinions, be it good or bad.
And like, I've had friends who've like said exactly what you've said, you know, that like, I love my, like, I hate being pregnant. Like, this is worst. Like, just, it's such varied experiences, and others being like, it was so easy.
Yeah. It's even like labor. Like, I was an OB resident. I remember people used to come into the labor floor with these like birth plans I want, and I'd be like, okay. Like, all right, whatevs. You see the way it goes. But even like for me, I remember showing up and the nurses were like, I think you can do this without an epidural. I'm like, yeah, no, I want an epidural. I don't want to like be in pain. People like push their own feelings of how labor is supposed to go on you. And I'm like, yeah, even the breastfeeding. I'm like,
I know.
You don't want to
my
breastfeed,
God.
don't breastfeed. Like, why is everyone all over you?
Yeah, no, you're in a good place now because I think that it has come a long way. Like social media has come a long way, and being able to just be like the real you as a mom is okay, but it's It's hard no matter what, right?
People are always going to say like what they feel. Oh, I wouldn't have done that if I was pregnant. I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't do this. I remember even breastfeeding my younger daughter. I was like 4 months and I was like, I hate this. Why am I doing this? Like I was back at work, I was pumping. And my pediatrician was like, you should just go out for a steak dinner. I'm like, what? That's the worst advice I've ever. So then I like bought that Similac. I opened it up and I was like, I'm never looking back. Like, who cares? Like, I don't care. I just couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah,
you know.
And you find your little army of people that you actually trust and listen to, and then you just like tune out the rest of the nonsense.
So true.
Then what is the survival rate of frozen eggs?
Most frozen eggs are going to survive the thaw today, right? Like if you had frozen your eggs, you know, when women froze their eggs 10, 15 years ago, I'm like, I don't know if those are going to survive. But today, I usually say 80 to 90% will survive the thaw. Embryo survival is 98% because you're talking about one cell. The egg is one cell with a lot of water, and an embryo is many cells, and it's a different situation. But your survival, when you look at egg freezing, you can't compare an egg, like one egg to one embryo, because you have to look at the eggs as a cohort or a group. So I say to women, like if you get 12 eggs and that provides you with one viable embryo, you need to look at it like that as opposed to, oh, look at my 12 eggs, they didn't have that same potential. But an egg to an embryo is so different.
So different.
Whit, I actually have a question, and obviously both of you guys will jump in. But you said that you did IVF and then egg freezing.
So I did. I was doing IVF. So essentially, the process to IVF, you have to like go through egg retrieval. So basically, I did the egg retrieval, which is what you would do in order to
freeze embryos.
To freeze them, and then you would just make the embryos and freeze them. And then when you were ready, you would decide whether you wanted to do a transplant yourself, a surrogate, whatever. But I had to do an egg retrieval to then freeze the embryos.
Got it. Because IVF stands for in vitro fertilization. So everyone who's going to use their eggs when they're frozen is going to do IVF, right? Because fertilization will happen in the lab. But either it happens immediately when you're freezing embryos or it happens delayed when you thaw the eggs and fertilize with your sperm source.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's good. This is very like 101 because I didn't know any of this stuff prior to this either. Yeah.
Oh, most people don't. Like,
no.
Sometimes people think like, I've heard people be like, oh, I get pregnant when I have my period. I'm like, no, that's wrong. Or like, I'm like, oh, whoa, we're going to like sex ed 101.
Yeah.
I joke around because I go to my daughter, I have 2 girls, 9 and 12, and I'll go to their school to talk about this. And they're so embarrassed. They're like, Mom,
like
about sperm and sex. I'm like, it shouldn't be that embarrassing, guys.
No.
It's honestly, I wish this was education that I got when I was like 18, 16. You know what I mean?
Totally.
Like,
when you're actually thinking about that and when I know.
Because we're taught how not to get pregnant, but nobody tells you how to get pregnant.
No.
Yeah. And I always say we go through our 20s being like, dear God, I hope I am not pregnant. And then you hit 30 and you're like, dear God, this is actually sort of hard.
Yeah, totally.
Like, who knew there was like 1 or 2 days you're supposed to have sex? Like the whole thing was mind blowing.
Or you're like, you still don't know if you, like for me, even when I was your age and we decided to try, I still wasn't at a point mentally where I was ready. I was just like, I know we want to do this. I'm just going to like throw caution to the wind and just go for it. Like, who knows how long this is going to take. And then when I actually got pregnant, I was like, shit, like this is real. I can't believe I'm actually doing this. But it almost was just, at least looking back on it for me, like the best way to do it because I wasn't overthinking. But I think right now it's also you're in like prime like career building mode, and if that's what feels true to you, that's what your gut tells you that you need to serve, then obviously like lucky for this that you have this option.
That's the thing, like it's insurance at the end of the day, you know. And like I think like people are so different. Like I've had friends who were like I just knew I wanted to be a mom, right? And I was talking to my EA in the car and I was like, yeah, you know, I think I want a kid at some point. Like, it would be nice to be a mom at some point. But when I have looked at what I've wanted my whole life, like, yes, like at some point I would like to have a kid. But for me, like, my entire purpose in life was like success and career, you know, like that was my thing. And so I would give anything for that. But
you're not ready to give, you're not ready to like bring something else in that will derail that.
Exactly.
And I have so much respect for that. And I think that's so powerful for you to be able to like acknowledge and admit, because so many women are so scared to be honest about that and are afraid that they'll be judged, that they're putting their career before what, life, society expects from us. But that's why we can do this. And then who knows, you can use them or not.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like, whether it could never be time, or you could think 5 years down the road when the business is a little bit more off the ground. You're so lucky to have these.
That's the thing. And like, that's why it's like, it's conversations like this are important, because I mean, I don't know, like, where else do you learn about stuff like this? Like, it's not
you don't learn about it for me until you had to deal with it. Like, what about for you?
That's why I have to write the book, because we
need absolutely,
because you go to your GYN, right, and she or he says to you, you need a pap smear, like STD testing, maybe a mammogram, but nobody really sits with you and is like, hey, what are your fertility plans? And I've thought a lot about this, like, why don't we? Is it because we don't want to bring it up as an OB? Do we think it's like we're being invasive? But that's sort of your job. Like, we should start to talk about it and say, okay, if you think you want to do something like a career, maybe you should freeze your eggs, or at least check your egg quantity. Because if you check and you're low, maybe you need to do it now. Like, then at least you have data. And that's the thing. Like, I get it. Egg freezing is expensive, and I'm not here to push like, oh, everyone should do it. But you should just know your options, because if you don't know, then you're going to be really screwed and you're going to be really mad. It's not.
Yeah, the being in the dark is like not it.
No,
it's not the vibe.
No, you always want to know what all of your options are. Out of curiosity, like on a daily basis at CCRM, like what are you most dealing with, would you say?
So my career has morphed into, I'm the director of egg freezing for the whole country. So I would say 70% of the patients I see now are egg freezing.
Okay.
Which it changed, what changed? The pandemic. So during the pandemic is when the people freezing eggs skyrocketed.
Wow.
First, I thought it was because, people are at home. But then the more, all I do is talk to women all day long. The more I spoke to women, it was like, I think now that I'm home, or like now that I paused my life, I think I do want to maintain the opportunity. Like, I may want to have a family, so I'm here to do this. So I think the pandemic was like a major shift at how we looked at our lives. And then a lot of companies realized to retain good female talent, they had to offer it. So then like friends were doing it. So groups of friends were coming in. So that's like primarily what I spend my day doing. And I joke around like, yes, I'm a fertility doctor, but really I'm there to like, tell me about your life. Like, what are you thinking? And
like I have holistically look at the clients 100%. And help them with their plan. Yeah.
And more than once I've said, and like this has not been my best, but I've been like, I don't know about that guy. I've been like, I think you should freeze eggs.
Yeah. No, good for you.
Yeah. As you should. As you should.
Because I'm sitting there and I'm like watching the dynamic, and I'm always like, I don't know if this is.
And can you do both? Can she, if you're lucky enough, can you do some eggs and some embryos?
I generally don't like women to do it in the same cycle, because then you're sort of like splitting the cohort into too many angles. If you have a ton of eggs, sure, you can take 10 and just say, I'm going to put them aside for myself. But if you get 10 eggs, I'll say, listen, do a round of eggs and do a round of embryos. And then you have your own stuff for the end of the day, should you need to use them. And like, then you're not beholden to a guy. Because like, I've seen patients even who've had cancer and their male partners are like, no, you can't use the embryos. And then they're in menopause. And like, what are they going to do? They can't do anything.
If someone is wanting to freeze eggs or embryos, are there things that they can do like in their life from like a health and wellness perspective?
Great question. Question. So this, I would say this is a huge like growth in IVF in the fertility world, because we now really look at inflammatory disorders and how they affect not just like your GI, like we were talking about, or your body. It can affect your fertility. So you don't have to change your life. Like, you don't have to say, I'm going to go gluten-free, no alcohol for it. Like, that doesn't have to change. But should you be a healthy version of yourself? Sure, you should try, right? I always say, like, people get pregnant in the, doing drugs, the worst of circumstances. So don't blame yourself if you're like, I had rosé and pasta, that's why my eggs are terrible. I'm like, no, that is not why your eggs are terrible. But you can do things to make yourself healthier.
Yeah. Just basically general health, like move your body for 30 minutes 3 times a week, like generally stay healthy, everything in moderation, but nothing. Yeah.
Oh, I'm good.
You're good. Yeah, you're good.
We don't know. Like, we don't know the benefits. Like, people are like, what if I'm in a stressful job? And I'm like, then you stress about stress and you're more stressed. So then you have stress. Like,
right.
if it's like I had an accountant and she was like, I'm going to do it during April. I'm like, isn't that tax season? Yeah. She was like, oh, I'm like, maybe May or like February. I don't know. It's
maybe
like,
she wanted to go MIA.
Like,
She's like, I'm off for April.
Yeah, exactly. But like, it's true, right? Like, don't pick the most stressful time of your life to do it. But the reality is we all live lives and have to like function and move forward.
Yeah. It's interesting you said that thing about COVID though, because both my best friend and my sister did it during COVID because they were both in a place of like they were on their own and doing a lot of self-reflection. Totally. And is this something that I'm, going to be doing on my own eventually? Yep. Yeah.
I always give it up to the women that do what we call it single mother by choice. So women who will come in and use their eggs with donor sperm. That actually increased a lot during COVID. Like the sperm bank saw a decrease in available sperm.
Wow.
Because women who were like in their later 30s would say, hey, you know what? I actually want to be a parent. Like, screw the egg freezing. Let's just get some donor sperm. So I'm like, that's great. Look at you. Like, and that's the thing, right? Like families, I always say, like families are what you make of it.
Yeah.
So if you use an egg donor or a sperm donor, like, we have to let go that 2.3 kids in the white picket fence. Like, who really cares
anymore? How it was
doesn't
made.
matter.
It's
like
how they're raised.
Exactly. Your kid is who they are because of who you make them be. Totally. So I always say, people who struggle with, do I use an egg donor? Do I use a sperm donor? I'm like, that kid is your kid because you're their parent.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter where their genetics came from. It doesn't matter who carries your kid. Like, that's still your child because you're going to raise that person.
Right.
So,
absolutely.
And what about the laws? Because like New York, is surrogacy legal
it's now
there yet?
legal.
Yeah, I was like, because when we were starting to look for surrogates, I feel like it wasn't. But it's so crazy how things are still not legal in places.
Especially foreign countries. We see a lot of patients from Asia who come over to do surrogacy because it's not legal there.
Really?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. So I have to say, like, the U.S. is probably the most advanced in terms of its reproductive laws, but states vary. So you may live in a state where, the laws are different. Then California is a very good state to have a surrogate in because the laws are very liberal. But you always want to make sure, like, you have a lawyer and the lawyer helps guide you.
Also, okay, I have another question. Like, do you freeze your eggs in the place that you live in or, like, where you want to get pregnant? Does it
depends.
matter?
I've had a lot of patients say, like, my parents live in New York, so I'm going to come home and do it in New York, like, on break. I'm going to do it, because CCRM is a network, we can ship our eggs and embryos amongst all of our clinics, right? So if you happen to be living in Houston, you make your embryos and then you're in New York, just send the embryos to us. Like, that's fine. But I think you should do it where you have support, is what I tell women. Like, if your family lives in Houston, do it in Houston. But it has to be what's right for you.
I was just with someone, and it was so coincidental. When we were traveling last week, we're in Chicago, and she actually used a surrogate and used CCRM in Colorado. And she was like, tell them that they've been amazing. And like, she tried for years.
Well, CCRM Colorado is where it all started.
Yes.
And I always say this, I trained in New York, and everyone used to send their patients to Colorado when they couldn't get pregnant because CCRM was known to be like the best fertility clinic in the world.
Right.
And then they started to open up satellite locations where they would train the lab, and then like they would hire the doctors. Mm-hmm. So all of our labs are the same, but all of the success came from the Colorado location.
Got it.
And that's why they're known to be who they are.
Okay. With our specific embryos, we got like grades and whatnot, and we're told technically which ones were the strongest and down the line. One was not tested for sex because maybe it was like a little bit on the weaker side, so they didn't want to do that testing. But we ended up putting one of the embryos that was weaker because it was a girl, because we wanted a girl. Yep. And so I'm just wondering, like, they say it's weaker, but they're like, it's still great. And that's what's confusing, So what happens is the embryo grade and the day it's tested. So embryos can be biopsied on day 5, day 6, or day 7 of their life. Day 5s are the best, then day 6, then day 7. So we generally will pick a day 5 embryo first, and then we look at its grading. It gets 2-letter grades. There's AA, AB, there's C's, there's D's. So we'll always go for the A's, then the B's, and the C's, the D's. It doesn't mean if you put back like a DD, you're having a DD child. People always ask me, I'm like, no, it's implantation chances. So my 5AA is going to implant
much greater than my 6cc.
How much greater?
Depends on the day it was biopsy. So if you have a day 5 AA in our
Yeah.
lab, you're talking about a 70-75% live birth rate.
Okay.
But if you have a day 7, that's 35%. So it's a huge difference based on the day of the biopsy and the grading. Now, a lot of couples will come in and they'll be like, I want a female, I have a male, I want to have a female. And I'm like, okay, let's just look at the success and base our decision on that.
Yeah, so that's why we're about to fill out which embryo we want for this second transfer. And in my heart, I'm like, I kind of know what I want, but it doesn't, I want to know really, I want to look at the grading again and make sure that I'm having that conversation.
You
with
want to
the
make sure you're not
doctor
picking
to know
like
the
a day
chances.
exactly.
Yeah, because I don't fully remember. Like that's the other thing is like each time you go through this, there's so many other things to like look at and rehab the conversation. And
Well, it's also like data that's not like for you. Like I always say, I think sometimes we forget as doctors, like patients are not doctors, right? So we will pick up the phone and be like, and then hang up. And I think that's like not. So now I always say I had breast cancer when I was 39, and it actually was the best thing that happened to me because I learned how to be so much of a better doctor. I will never forget this doctor calling me and being like, "Do you have breast cancer?" And I was like, and then she hung up, and I was like, oh my God, like what just happened? Like I was
have a
so
million
out
questions.
of sorts. And I was like, I can't. So now what I do is when I call patients, I'll always say, is this a good time? If not, when should I call you back so we can sit? Because I think we forget, like, it's our everyday. That's all we do is look at embryos and eggs.
Right.
But
you're like, you have 3 ABs
correct.
at a day 6,
It's not
and
your
a
everyday.
blastocyte of this,
Correct.
and you're
You
like,
need time to
wait,
process.
whoa, there's 5 of them. Can you please go through each one and the pros and the cons of each one?
And
like,
that can't be done sometimes in 5 minutes, like while I'm trying to eat lunch, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it doesn't work. And I think sometimes I always say, like, what do we not teach medical students well? We don't teach medical students how to give bad news and how to be empathetic, right? Because
that's such a hard
it's
thing
hard.
to teach.
And you
Sometimes
learn
it
that.
really you learn it, or it comes naturally. It seems like it's
or you never
innately in
learn it,
you,
and then
or
you're
then
like,
you have terrible bedside
Yeah,
manner.
exactly.
So are you able to pick which doctor you go to when you're deciding to do this process?
Yeah.
You can?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes people just say, I'll take the next available. Sometimes people are like, I want a male or I want a female or whatever it is. But usually people will pick based on like preference.
Yeah. And we had a scenario where our doctor was going to be out of town for the transfer, and we could have had a different doctor do the transfer. And I was like, no, I even though it's like a very probably basic procedural thing, I was like, I want my doctor to be the one to do it. So you can.
That is the hardest thing we do, though, is the transfer.
It is.
Like, that's the one thing that I always say takes you the longest to have good success for, right? Because it's like retrievals are fairly simple procedures. And we say 80% of transfers are easy, but then there's 20% that like may be tricky.
Yeah.
But that's where like, doing this for several years, you're like, oh, I know exactly what I can do at this point.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm coming to you.
Yeah, you should.
No, like
You should.
you're incredible.
Oh, that's so nice of you. We can go to the Sporting Rich store.
There we go.
Yeah, and now I'm like, I want you to look at all of my embryos and tell me which one to put in. Okay, amazing. You've been so awesome.
This was so fun.
Yeah, fun and easy. Thank you.
Honestly, thank you so much. I learned
Of course.
so much.
Thank you for having me. This was great.